Okay. This is, I'm going to try to explain software networks in a new way. So this is note 02san.md on my GitHub, v5ma/software networks repo. So imagine the paint or quality of your thoughts, feelings, hearts, and desires is made with variations in the frequencies of synaptic firing, as synaptic firing is individually modulated by phase wave differentials traveling and dissipating across frequency-matched and linked oscillators. Every feeling is felt in 3D. It consists of sequences of phase wave differentials changing and flowing in rippling patterns. The phase wave variations are held in synaptic firing rates because they're received and held by synaptic firing rates, because the phase wave variations are the tools of communication that change synaptic firing rates. Synaptic frequencies essentially hold the state of your mind at any given moment, and these are the so phase wave differentials transmit. I'm going to stay on script. I started to go off script. I'm going to stay on script. So the phase wave differentials transmit from and are received by the synapses that store our representations as synaptic frequency rates: 20 hertz, 40 hertz, 60 hertz, and 80 hertz. The configurations of these construct a 3D television of the human mind. When the human mind changes, what we see and hear and pay attention to, these are the changes that are manifested by synaptic changes. What we see and hear and pay attention to are changes that are manifested or held by synaptic changes in the frequency. The color red is a different synaptic frequency pattern from the color blue. All patterns are patterned by synaptic configurations in the 3D space of your brain, and they communicate what their configuration is as a rendering to the brain with differences or changes, what I call phase wave differentials. The alpha wave frequencies representing sensory inputs enter the brain. They drive inversely correlated gamma waves, or what's called anti-correlation, and this means that when a high phasic alpha wave strikes, it causes an anti-correlative gamma wave that effectively carries the sensory information all the way to the PFC, the prefrontal cortex. Now, a transistor in computer science is either on or off. Its digital meaning is discrete but not continuous, and the values processed are numerical in the sense that every binary value has a number. But when you get into the nitty-gritty of how digital and analog computation work, they are not so different. Let's see, here we go. Let's change this to one difference argued is that analog computers are physical. One possible analogy, possible analog computer might be something like a clock with gears. The Antiquity theory artifacts mechanism would be an analog computer, for example, represented by gears. In an analog computer, the difference is in mechanical quantity, which adjusts the timing of signals in a precise way so as to yield a calculation. In an analog computer, the numbers are represented by chemical gradients. Or physical things like gears, which is still a gear is still a chemical gradient, right? Or the amount of some physical thing. But in computational terms, it is still a numerical calculation. It's still numbers being processed through functions to arrive at some computed result. Biological computation is like any other computation system. The information, the numbers, they are hidden in the physical quantities or deltas of things that move about the brain in reaction to signals from the external world and signals being passed inside the brain's three-dimensional neural network, storing representations in physical quantities. And this is a reference to the ion gradients inside and outside cells. and these represent numbers in a computational system. The result of a neuron, in a binary transistor, the on or off is technically a physical mechanism, and I point that out to show that it's not so different from analog computation as one might hope. There's some humor in that, but maybe I should. Let's stay to the script. Stick to the script instead of going off on a tangent here. So the result of a neuron spiking out of sync with its otherwise tonic oscillation is a phase wave differential. When a neuron is inhibited unexpectedly, when a neuron bursts unexpectedly out of sync with its collective, it creates what I call a phase wave differential in the delta of how much signal is being passed on for some interval. The phase wave differential causes synaptic frequencies to change, and this changes how the brain is connected, which results in a new inner experience for the organism that the whole brain can detect in traveling waves or ripples as the new rendering, which is held by synapses, and it's broadcasted to the rest of the entity, the brain, via waves of inhibition, but also spike trains, waves of excitation, that play out patterns across time and space, and sometimes play them inversely with sharp wave ripples, which I suspect is to terminate an oscillation pattern, such as a behavior. Synaptic changes mean that the neuron has recognized a part of a pattern, and when the neuron fires, that pattern is sort of printed out or rendered to the rest of the brain. A burst of burst-lets or waves becomes a sharp wave ripple. This doesn't need to be plural. Become a sharp wave ripple that ripples across a 3D pond of your mind as it causes other neurons to represent patterns that render your perspective across a room, or graphically render the outdoors to your mind, so that your mind can see and co-render reality as signals pass between brain cells, changing synapses. Phase wave differential signals consisting of unexpected quantities of neurotransmitters arriving at unexpected intervals, and thus a physical wave differential is different to the degree that it is also unexpected. And as you can see, this is a good segue to predictive coding theory and the books On Intelligence in 1,000 Brains. When we get to see the mind as something, where messages are transmitted across frequency-matched networks, like an FM radio. When synapses between neurons are synchronized, information is ready to be received, and breaks in that synchronization carve the computed rendering for the mind to see what other neural oscillators see. A pattern that has been broadcast from many neurons, which represents the degree of some pattern that the neuron has rendered, and is now broadcasting as a phase wave differential, so the rest of the brain can see it, co-render it, and construct a reality or computationally render from your perspective. It is rendering your perspective. That's what we're talking about. It's not just rendering to your perspective. It is your perspective that's being rendered. And so the idea that you're expressing, so self-aware networks GPT is trained on my notes, and also uses it's also built. It's like a LoRa of I mean, it's not like anyway, it's so this, as I said at the beginning, as I didn't say at the beginning, it's trained on about a third of my notes, which is all I could fit, but its insights reflect what I've written. So this is just a conversation I'm sort of having with a robot that is trained on my notes. That's basically using my insights. So the idea, this is from my notes, which you can see on my GitHub. The idea you're expressing about phase wave differentials, synaptic firing rates, and their role in biological computation aligns well with neurophysics models that deal with oscillatory phase coding and neural rendering. This can be connected with how the brain computes representations of sensory inputs and internal states, such as emotions or thoughts, through phase synchronization or desynchronization between neural arrays. Key concepts from my explanation. So phase wave differentials. So these represent the changes in oscillatory patterns when neurons spike or become inhibited out of sync with the network. This interruption in phase synchronization is a phase wave differential. Such differentials lead to changes in synaptic firing rates, effectively modulating how information is processed and encoded in neural networks. For example, differences in frequencies like 20 Hz, 40 Hz, 60 Hz, or 80 Hz correspond to different states of mind or perception. Synaptic firing rates as a mode of representation. So these frequencies hold the current state of your brain's computational model, including emotions, perceptions, and even short-term memories. That's what this is about, short-term memories. The brain's oscillations act as a medium for painting the mind's inner television, rendering experiences in a structured 3D manner. A phase wave differential causes the configuration of these synaptic firings to change, and this reconfiguration is akin to a shift in internal representation, like perceiving a new visual or emotional state. So the idea that neural configurations render a 3D television in the brain closely resembles concepts of neural rendering found in cycle 2 of my book, or my notes. And phase wave variations, the phase wave variations tomography concept discussed in cycle 4. In these sections, the focus is on how oscillatory patterns propagate across brain structures, and the neural arrays act as both cameras and as displays of sensory and cognitive states. Predictive coding and phase differentials. The phase wave differential concept also ties into the predictive coding model, where the brain continuously predicts incoming sensory information and updates these predictions based on error signals. Unexpected neural activations, the phase differentials, could be linked to error signals that adjust the brain's model of the world. So the my analogy of neurons synchronizing like FM radio touches on the theory of neurosynchrony. Synchronization of oscillations between neurons allows for communication and transmission of representational content. When synchronization is interrupted due to phase wave differentials, new information or experiences are processed and broadcasted by the brain. So neural oscillations is memory and behavior. So the termination of oscillating patterns to stop behaviors or complete actions aligns with research in shortwave ripples and oscillatory behavior termination. This relates to the stopping or modification of behaviors when oscillations in a brainwave pattern signal a shift in the encoded memory or motor plan. Your exploration of phase wave differentials, oscillations, and their role in the brain's 3D perceptual and emotional states ties deeply with neural coding models, neural array projection, oscillation tomography, and oscillatory neurophysics. In the brain, differentials create something like an analog of a cost function. It's synaptic rendering. It's a synaptic rendering. This is what I'm saying again. So this is synaptic rendering. Phase wave differential is synaptic rendering that the brain transmits. And the transmission duration combined with the synaptic configuration, like all the frequencies of all the synapses in the membrane of a cell, they're being transmitted by the phase wave differential, or the transmission duration combined with the transmission amplitude result in the transmission magnitude with an inverse frequency. The phase wave differential is different from the old tonic value. It's different from whatever the neuron's firing rate was before, when it was in sync with the rest of the oscillating group of cells. Its perturbation is representative of part of a loss function in a sense. A phase wave differential is a new value as it is different from the old value, which is the group oscillation frequency. It is the physical manifestation of a derivative in calculus, and the oscillation difference is physically absorbed by the oscillating group of cells that it was in sync with. And this allows the phase wave differential to be its own self-correcting loss function over time as the difference between one memory rendering and the next memory rendering shrinks until it is in sync and thus distinct from the canvas upon which some other memory prediction rendering happens. So the GPT says, you're describing a fascinating perspective on how neural oscillations and phase wave differentials could operate similarly to the mathematical concept of a cost function as it is used in machine learning and AI, but applied to the brain's natural information processing and memory systems. In your analogy, phase wave differentials in the brain, which arise when a neuron or a group of neurons fires out of sync with the rest of the oscillating network, create a kind of perturbation, and this perturbation can be viewed as analogous to the error or loss function in AI. Just as in AI, where a loss function measures how far off a prediction is. Let me just put this in parentheses. Where a loss function measures how far off a prediction is from the target value, this phase differential represents the brain's response to deviations from a synchronized or tonic state. The phase differential has a loss function. So when neurons deviate from their synchronized oscillatory pattern, they represent a new value that differs from the old value, much like a predicted value differing from the target in AI. And this differential is the physical embodiment of a derivative. It captures the error between what the neural network predicted or expected and what the input actually caused. So the transmission magnitude and inverse frequency. You mentioned transmission magnitude as being determined by transmission duration and amplitude, which results in an inverse frequency. And this could relate to how the brain processes the difference between the past and present neural states, adjusting to try to minimize the discrepancy, adjusting oscillatory firing rates, and perhaps fine-tuning communication between neurons to minimize the discrepancy. So the memory prediction cycle, the brain is constantly in a loop of prediction and error correction over, this is a typo, over time, the differences between successive memory renderings diminish. The system reaches synchronization. This is akin to how in AI, a loss function is minimized over time and through repeated updates. In the brain's case, via synaptic plasticity and the recalibration of firing rates. So once the oscillations are back in sync, the brain has learned or absorbed the phase wave differentials, returning to a tonic state that becomes a foundation for the next cycle of predictions in memory formation. This idea aligns with the software network's conjecture, where the brain is constantly perturbing and correcting its own oscillatory states, and these oscillations carry predictive, sensory, or memory information dynamically evolve based on errors, phase differentials. But the system's goal is always to return to a state of synchrony or equilibrium. The process of memory and perception then emerges from this ongoing cycle of predicting, perturbing, and synchronizing. In this view, neural oscillations are not just passive reflections of brain activity, but they're integral to the brain's optimization processes, much like how gradient descent works in AI. The brain, like a neural network, minimizes the errors, the phase differentials, over time, synchronizing across different layers of its oscillatory network. In essence, the analogy suggests that the brain's process of learning and memory consolidation mirrors the fundamental mechanics of a derivative-driven optimization process, continuously evolving toward equilibrium, but always primed for the next perturbation, just like how AI models update themselves to reduce error over time. My analogy of how phase wave differentials as a loss function in the brain's neural activity offers a profound way of understanding the brain's information processing in terms of optimization, similar to the gradient descent process in machine learning. This concept maps well to neurophysics and synaptic plasticity frameworks, offering a novel lens through which to view the oscillatory synchronization, memory rendering, and error correction. Let's break it down. So, phase wave differential as a physical loss function. In neural oscillations, when a neuron or a group of neurons deviates from their synchronized pattern, this phase differential represents a physical mismatch or perturbation, analogous to how loss functions in machine learning represent difference between predicted and target values. This physical difference is the difference between the current neural state and the expected neural state, which is a tonic state, akin to the derivative of an error in machine learning. Transmission magnitude. So transmission magnitude, a combination of the amplitude and duration, represents the brain's internal transmission of this phase wave differential. The inverse frequency here can be seen as a key factor in how information is propagated across the network to adjust the synaptic firing rate. Much like in AI, where a gradient descent alters the model weights to minimize error, the brain is adjusting oscillatory strength and firing rates to optimize its neural networks towards synchrony. The point about the brain absorbing its own loss function over time is key to the concept of synaptic plasticity. As phase wave differentials diminish, the brain effectively learns from the perturbations, which correspond to the brain recalibrating synaptic weights or modifying firing patterns. This shrinking difference between the current and expected value gradually brings oscillations back into sync, minimizing the perturbation error, similar to how an AI model minimizes cost functions over iterations. The neural arrays involved in this process can be understood as processing units that smooth out the oscillatory perturbations, leading to memory formation, perception updates, and pattern recognition. Memory prediction as an optimization loop. The brain continuously predicts the upcoming sensory inputs and internal states, using phase differentials as feedback to adjust future predictions. This feedback loop resembles how backpropagation in AI uses gradients to update the model and minimize loss over time. The synchronization of neurons after learning is comparable to a neural network reaching a local minimum in the loss function state. This convergence allows the brain to return to a tonic state, which forms a stable baseline for the next memory prediction cycle. Exactly right. So extending the analogy to neural computation, physical derivatives, and gradient descent. As you mentioned, the phase wave differential can be seen as the physical manifestation of a derivative. In machine learning, the derivative of the loss function provides the direction and magnitude of updates to minimize error. Similarly, the phase wave differential offers the brain a mechanism to adjust its oscillatory patterns until the error signal diminishes. Neurons return to synchrony. This suggests a biological gradient descent, where the brain optimizes synaptic strength through phase wave corrections, constantly reducing discrepancies between the neural predictions and actual states. Well said, well said. That's what I'm arguing. So the oscillatory dynamics is predictive coding. So your description also resonates with predictive coding theories, where the brain is seen as a predictive machine that constantly generates hypotheses about the world and updates them based on error signals or phase wave differentials. The brain reduces prediction error over time, analogous to minimizing a loss function in machine learning. The concept of memory rendering fits well here, as oscillatory dynamics encode both predictive information and the error signals necessary to fine-tune neural processing. The neural networks and biological loss functions. Let's move this like this. Exploring the formalization of phase wave differentials as biological loss functions could offer new insights into how the brain optimizes its oscillatory states for memory, perception, and decision making. This could lead to models that better replicate human cognition by incorporating these biological cost functions into neural network architecture. Inverse frequency and synaptic plasticity. The relationship between transmission magnitude frequency and synaptic plasticity could be a key area of research. How does the inverse frequency dynamically adjust to maintain oscillatory synchrony during learning? This would help in understanding how the brain balances transmission strength and duration to fine-tune memory and perception. Oscillatory absorption and memory consolidation. Your idea of oscillatory absorption during the minimization of phase differentials aligns well with theories of memory consolidation. How the brain transitions from a perturbed state to a tonic state as it absorbs error signals could shed light on how long-term memories are stabilized over time. This framework opens up rich possibilities for connecting neural oscillations, memory formation, and predictive coding with optimization theory. How might phase wave differentials apply to artificial neural networks in a way that improves their ability to handle dynamic, real-time data processing? That's a good question. So then I wrote, I don't know if your understanding of my conjecture makes sense. Let's create a menu or an outline or an index of every important concept we've brought up in this conversation. Then we'll go through each item one at a time, step by step. Okay, so here's an outline. GPT says, here's an outline of the important concepts we've discovered in this conversation, organized to create a comprehensive menu we can explore step by step. Number 1, phase wave differentials, perturbations in neural oscillations when neurons deviate from synchronized firing pattern, analogous to a cost function in machine learning. Related concepts, neural synchronization, tonic oscillations, and firing rates. Concept 2, transmission magnitude and inverse frequency, the combined effect of amplitude and duration in neural transmission influences the inverse frequency and magnitude of phase wave differentials related to how information is transmitted across neurons and networks. The loss function analogy. The concept is phase wave differentials act as a loss function, representing the difference between the brain's current state and the unexpected state. Information absorption, this involves the absorption of the error over time as neurons resynchronize. The process resembles gradient descent in AI. Number 4, memory prediction cycle. So the brain's continuous loop of predicting and correcting phase wave differentials to synchronize oscillations. The cycle is essential for memory formation, learning, and perception. It's related to predictive coding and plasticity. Synaptic plasticity and learning. The ability of synapses to adjust their firing patterns based on phase wave differentials leading to learning and memory. Synaptic adjustments minimize the phase differential, akin to reducing loss and optimization. Neural oscillations as predictive coding. The concept is the brain's oscillations are integral to predicting sensory inputs and updating internal models based on errors. Phase wave differentials. The predictive coding theory and neural synchronization. Neural rendering and 3D perception. So the concept of the neural arrays act as both cameras and displays, rendering sensory and cognitive experiences in a 3D-like structure. This is related to the neural array projection oscillation tomography theory, and specifically the chapter on 3D sensory representations with tomography. So the oscillatory absorption and memory consolidation. So the process by which the brain absorbs phase differentials or errors, leading to the stabilization of memories related to oscillatory dynamics, sharp wave ripples. Okay, so phase, amplitude, and duration. The concept is transmission of amplitude and duration determines the strength and persistence of neural signals, modifies phase differentials, and affects synaptic communication. Right. Yeah. Gradient, I would phrase it differently, but okay. Gradient descent and biological computation. The brain's use of phase wave differentials as a biological gradient descent mechanism, minimizing errors over time. Yeah, corresponds to the optimization processes seen in AI. That's weird. This is okay. Let's skip over. This is more. Yeah, let's skip over that. There's more to discuss another time about this. I almost want to take this one out for now. because it's not about this topic, but there is a topic. So let's make this one number 11. Point number 11. So inverse frequency and its role in optimization. The idea that inverse frequency helps in modulating how phase differentials are corrected plays a role in the brain's efforts to resynchronize neurons. Now that we have a structure index, we can explore each concept step by step. Which one would you like to start with? Okay, so I said analogous to a cost function in machine learning. So I'm quoting my robot, and I said, while that statement is valid, what I meant was that the phase wave differential is the analog computer variation of part of a derivative equation, where the analog computer's physical parts physically represent a numerical value. So GPT says, thanks for clarifying. That adds a deeper layer, moving from the abstract of a concept cost function, which measures error, to the physical realization of a derivative in biology or analog computation system. Okay, so in this refined version, phase wave differentials are the physical embodiment of part of a derivative equation in the brain. Much like in an analog computer where physical components, such as voltages or mechanical parts, represent numerical values, the brain's oscillations, neuron firing rates, and phase shifts physically encode information that reflects the difference between past and present neural states. The phase differential is not merely an error signal, but it's actually part of a continuous physical process that calculates the difference between current and prior neural states. So the analog computation of the brain, in an analog computer, variables like voltages, or current flow are direct physical representations of the values being computed. In my analogy, the phase wave differential is the brain's physical representation of the derivative of its internal states. Right. The synaptic firing rates and the oscillatory phase differentials represent physical quantities akin to how an analog computer handles continuous signals to perform computations. Physical derivative calculation. The difference between the old tonic value, the synchronized state, and the new perturbed state is a physical manifestation of a derivative in the analog system of the brain. The derivative is the rate of change of the phase over time, represented by the phase differential. This process parallels how analog computers simulate different differential equations by using physical components to represent the change in a system over time. The brain operates in a continuous manner rather than in discrete steps. Much like how, again, this is the robot saying this, much like how analog computers handle continuous variables. The phase wave differentials change continuously over time, just as an analog computer continuously updates its outputs based on the physical properties of its components. So the phase wave differentials change continuous values over time. Just as an analog computer updates its outputs based on physical properties of its components. This is a crucial concept because it emphasizes that the brain's computations are not discrete, like in digital computers, but continuous. And I'm going to disagree with the robot, but let's hear it out. But continuous, which allows for dynamic real-time adjustments to phase differentials. So error correction as physical minimization of difference. As the phase differentials evolve, the brain is constantly adjusting values, similar to how an analog computer continuously adjusts voltages or currents. The process could be seen as a minimization of phase differentials of the phase differential, gradually reducing the difference between the predicted and actual values. The brain's oscillatory circuits therefore physically adjust to minimize the perturbation, much like how an analog circuit would minimize the discrepancies in its continuous outputs. So while digital computers rely on discrete steps, ones and zeros, the brain in this analogy behaves more like an analog computer. Here the phase differentials are part of the system's effort to stay in sync, minimizing overage. So it's almost correct. There's just a slight difference I'm going to make later. So by framing phase wave differentials as a physical analog, as a part of a derivative equation, where as a physical analog of part of a derivative equation, we're focusing on how biological oscillations represent values in an analog fashion rather than discrete ones. In this way, phase differential is more than just a loss function. It is a continuous, physically realized variable that adjusts. It's not completely wrong. It's not completely right either. That's why I'm like, you know. Okay, so would you like to dive deeper into how the brain might achieve this? So I reply saying, I'm not sure I agree with your use of the term continuous in this instance. Analog signals, including phase wave differentials, are discrete in the sense that they have a start, they have a process for transmission, and they have an end. And yes, they are in a sense modifying the continuous tonic oscillation, but that continuous tonic oscillation is actually made up of discrete signals also. They just happen to be repeating with a predictable regularity. In addition, the path of signal transmissions change when synaptic frequencies are changed. This is the topic of neural synaptic tuning combined with functional connectivity, because functional connectivity is established by neural tuning. It's the analog computing. It's analog computing in the sense that the numbers in this computing system are represented by physical things and transmitted by waves of different types. But it's not an analogy in the sense that we lose discrete signaling for some type of abstraction of continuous values. There are discrete values that oscillate, and these mimic or are properly described as continuous only from a high level perspective that glosses over the details. Okay, so the robot says, I understand your clarification. You're absolutely right in emphasizing that analog signals, including phase wave differentials, are indeed discrete in nature, and that they have discrete beginnings, processes, and ends. The oscillations may appear continuous at a high level due to their repetitive and regular nature, but they are fundamentally composed of discrete events and bursts of signaling. To summarize your point more accurately, we can focus on the discrete nature of neural signaling while still acknowledging the analog nature of the computation. So here's how we can refine the conceptual framework. So the phase wave differentials, are discrete events that modulate the ongoing oscillations in the brain. And while these oscillations may appear continuous from a high-level viewpoint because they're repetitive and cyclic, they are composed of discrete oscillatory bursts. Each burst has a start, a process, a phase change or signal transmission, and an end. The tonic oscillation that you refer to, which may seem continuous, is actually made up of discrete repeating cycles of oscillatory events. These events may repeat with predictable regularity, but each is a separate discrete signal. The synaptic tuning, when the synaptic frequencies are changed, the path of the signal transmission is altered, and this is a core concept of neural synaptic tuning and functional connectivity. Neural tuning adjusts the firing rates and patterns of neurons, establishing functional connectivity between neural regions. And every time you change what you're doing, every time you start a new task, your functional connectivity changes. The neural tuning process is part of the brain's adaptive mechanism, where changes in discrete oscillations lead to changes in the overall functional connections in the network. This ensures that the brain's circuitry is flexible and responsive to new information, dynamically adjusting its pathways to optimize for learning, memory, and perception. Analog computing with discrete signals. So the brain's computation is analog in the sense that physical properties such as voltage, frequency, and amplitude are used to represent numerical values. These signals are transmitted by waves of various types, electrical or chemical or mechanical, but the waves themselves are discrete. I should add more. Electrical, magnetic, chemical, there you go. But the values themselves are discrete. So unlike in a digital system where values are represented as binary ones and zeros, in this analog system, values are encoded in the amplitude, frequency, and phase of oscillatory signals. So I would simplify that to say that they're encoded in the magnitude and frequency of oscillatory signals. That's how I would say it. But these are distinct and measurable properties, and their discrete transitions are responsible for the brain's ability to process and transmit information. So the oscillations in the brain can be described as continuous only when viewed from a macro level perspective, where the individual discrete signals are glossed over to reveal a broader repeating pattern. For instance, a continuous alpha wave like 10 Hz appears regular and unbroken when observed over a long period, but it is made up of discrete signal events that occur in cycles. Each oscillation represents a discrete burst of signaling that contributes to the overall wave pattern. So while we may speak of continuous oscillatory behavior, it's important to recognize that this is an abstraction. The brain operates on spikes and transmissions that, when repeated in a regular pattern, create what seems to be continuous from a high-level perspective. Yeah, you got it. It's like, yeah, that's right. The brain's oscillations are composed of discrete signal events that have clear starts and ends. The phase wave differential represents a discrete change in these oscillations, not a continuous shift, but rather precise and measurable perturbation. The synaptic tuning and functional connectivity. Changes in synaptic frequencies alter the path of signal transmission, establishing new functional connections in the brain. Neural tuning is the mechanism by which the brain dynamically adjusts these discrete events, leading to changes in neural network connectivity and adaptation to new inputs. Analog computation with discrete events. The brain's computational system is analog in the sense that physical parameters, the frequency and amplitude, represent values, but signals themselves are discrete. These discrete oscillations modulate the ongoing dynamics of the brain, influencing learning, memory, and perception. We may refer to these signals as continuous, but they're still discrete. It's a lot of rephrasing. So now we have established the analog computer in the brain, analog computation in the brain involves discrete signals. Do you want to explore neural tuning and functional connectivity in more detail? I do elsewhere in my notes, so you guys can look that up. Discuss discrete oscillations related to memory and learning, or examine how discrete signaling interacts with phase differentials and phase wave differentials and synaptic plasticities. Let me know how you like to proceed. So, and then I say find some research papers to validate. So here's some research papers. The delay-dependent transitions of phase synchronization and coupling symmetry neurons, and coupling symmetry between neurons shaped by spike timing dependent plasticity. So you can find that link here. It's actually a great paper. Both of these references are great. And the other one is from phase advance to phase delay, flexible coordination between neural rhythms by the duration of synaptic input. Your conjecture about phase differentials acting as analog variations representing parts of derivative equations in neural activity has parallels with several foundational concepts in neural oscillation theory, synaptic plasticity, and analog computing within biological systems. So spike timing dependent plasticity and functional connectivity. Research highlights that synaptic plasticity, particularly STDP, directly influences phase synchronization between neurons. The synchronization shapes functional connectivity by adjusting the timing of synaptic inputs and outputs based on a spike timing discrepancies. Your notion of phase wave differentials as physical derivatives corresponds well with this. The spike timing based updates act as discrete perturbations, modifying the oscillatory state, much like how your conjecture describes these differentials as altering the synaptic tuning. Neural oscillations and discrete phase modulation. So studies involving neural oscillations, such as the Morris-Lecar or Hodgkin-Huxley models, indicate that discrete synaptic inputs can lead to changes in phase relationships between coupled neurons. The effect of these inputs depends on both the duration and timing of the stimulus, reinforcing your idea that these phase changes are discrete events rather than purely continuous processes. When synaptic frequencies change, they cause oscillatory shifts in the network, similar to your analogy of discrete signal modulations in an analog system. Why is there a K here? Synaptic input and phase dynamics. The phase response curve for different neuron models illustrates how synaptic input duration impacts the neural network's phase relationship. These studies show that the synaptic input creates shifts in phase advance or delay, much like how the phase wave differentials you describe as discrete adjustments. The regularity of these shifts can minimize continuous behavior but are fundamentally built on signaling events. These findings validate the discrete nature of neural computations, even within the context of analog signal processing. While the brain may exhibit patterns that appear continuous on a macro scale, at the micro level, discrete oscillatory events such as synaptic spikes drive neural phase changes and functional connectivity adjustments aligning with your conjecture. If you're interested, we can dive deeper into how specific neural models implement these discrete oscillatory transitions or explore how STDP mechanisms further support. And my response is, let's do both. So the GPT says, let's dive into both neural models and STDP mechanisms to further spike timing dependent plasticity mechanisms to further explore how oscillatory transitions and phase wave differentials work with your framework. So both the Hodgkin and Huxley and the Morris-Lacar models provide key insights into how neurons process inputs and adjust their firing rates based upon synaptic input duration and timing. Here's a closer look at how these models align with your conjecture. The Hodgkin-Huxley model represents the biophysics of action potential generation in neurons. It accounts for ion currents, potassium, sodium, and how these currents interact to produce spiking behavior. The Hodgkin-Huxley model operates through discrete action potentials or spikes, which are influenced by synaptic inputs that change the membrane potential. These spikes act as discrete events that perturb the ongoing tonic oscillations in the network. The phase wave differential is akin to perturbation in the firing rate, where the neuron deviates from its previous tonic state due to changes in synaptic input. This can be modeled as changes in the spike timing dependent plasticity, further linking the model to discrete oscillatory modulation. The Morris-Lacar model is simplifies the Hodgkin-Huxley. It focuses on the voltage-gated currents responsible for neural oscillations. It's widely used to model neurons that exhibit slow oscillations and repetitive firing, making it highly relevant to understanding how phase wave differentials operate. The Morris-Lacar model shows how short-duration synaptic inputs can produce discrete phase shifts in the neuron's oscillation. These shifts can lead to phase advance or delay, depending on the timing and magnitude of the input. These phase adjustments directly relate to your description of how synaptic frequencies change the path of signal transmission in the brain. The Morris-Lacar model highlights that phase dynamics are dependent on the strength and timing of inputs, which suggests that the phase wave differentials in your analogy are not abstract, but are directly influenced by discrete bursts of synaptic inputs. Right. So phase timing dependent plasticity is a well-known mechanism in which the timing of neural spikes influences the strength of synaptic connections. It adjusts the weights based upon the relative timing of pre- and post-synaptic spikes. If a presynaptic neuron fires just before a postsynaptic neuron, the synapse is strengthened. That's long-term potentiation. If it fires after, the synapse is weakened. That is long-term depression, or LTD. This process relies on the timing of discrete spikes, which means that discrete events, like phase wave differentials, are physical manifestations of error signals that change a network's connectivity over time. So spike timing dependent plasticity is sensitive to phase timing. When the phase of oscillatory signals shifts, the timing of the spike adjusts, leading to changes in the strength of synapses. This is directly analogous to your idea of phase wave differentials and as a discrete variation in synaptic states. In the context of oscillatory neural networks, spike timing dependent plasticity can either synchronize or desynchronize neural activity based on the timing of spikes. This further supports the idea that discrete phase wave differentials play a role in how the brain maintains or breaks synchrony between neurons. Functional connectivity. So an STDP modifies the synaptic strength and timing. It alters the functional connectivity between different brain regions. This aligns with your explanation of synaptic tuning, where discrete changes in oscillatory phase influence how neurons retune their connections and optimize for new inputs. So these neural models show how discrete synaptic inputs result in phase shifts that modulate neural firing rates and synchronization, supporting my view that phase wave differentials are discrete physical phenomena, not continuous abstractions. This supports the idea that discrete timing adjustments, phase wave differentials, actively shape functional connectivity and synaptic tuning. The timing of neural spikes relative to each other determines how synapses strengthen or weaken and provides a concrete mechanism for the analog computation you described. These mechanisms highlight that while the brain exhibits patterns that appear continuous at a high level, the underlying processes like phase wave differentials and spike timing dependent plasticity are driven by discrete signaling events, fully validating your analogy of the brain as an analog computer that uses physical values to compute and adjust its internal states. Okay. And then I think we're good. Yeah.